Well, good morning, church family. Good morning. Happy Sabbath to each of you. It is always good. There we go. To share together. I enjoy being here every Sabbath. I can tell you that this is a very welcoming church, right? We love being here. Giovanni, I have a special welcome for you. You know, we love your mom and your sister, right? Sister Hilda and Ashley, they're just terrific people, so we're glad you're here, and we're looking forward to getting to know you better. I appreciate men's ministry asking me to share a message today. Patrick asked me a month or so ago, and he said, yes, it's Father's Day, Sabbath, but you have license to speak on anything you wish, right? Righteous among the nations. Rather than a sermon on the important role fathers play in our lives, or a character sketch of famous fathers in the Bible, we could do that. Instead, I'd like to call your attention to two men that exemplified fatherhood, but perhaps of a different sort. One man recorded in Scripture, and this one, a more recent figure. His name is Chiune Sugihara. And when I first came across his story, I wasn't even sure I really believed it. It sounded to me like a fishtale. A story based on some truth, but exaggerated beyond all proportions because somebody needed a hero. But I researched it further, and I was able to corroborate his story with multiple sources. Do you want me to move this down? A study from Stanford University, a biography at the Holocaust Memorial, and I became a believer and an admirer. It was 1940 in the small country of Lithuania. Western Europe was embroiled in World War II, and Sugihara was a career Japanese diplomat assigned to Kaunas, which was at the time the capital of Lithuania. Transferred to Lithuania with his wife and 3 sons, he was there to staff a one-man Japanese consulate in Kaunas. And while Sugihara wasn't really a spy per se, his title was a cover for his real duties, which was to report to Japan on Russian and German troop movements. Sugihara had been in Lithuania only a few months in June of 1940 when Germany invaded Poland, resulting in a wave of Jewish refugees pouring into Lithuania to escape deportation and death at the hand of the Nazis. To add to the desperate situation, Russian troops rolled in from the east and annexed Lithuania in July, toppling the government and ordering all foreign consulates closed. Nearly all the embassies complied with Russia's order to leave the country, the consulates closing their doors, and the envoys returning safely home, obeying orders and getting out of harm's way. Only 2 consuls applied for permission to stay on a little longer: the Netherlands and Japan. Sugihara was granted only 3 weeks to close up shop. 3 weeks and hundreds of Jewish people whose lives hung in the balance. You see, the Nazis were blocking their passage west, and the Soviet occupation of Lithuania provided no security, and the Jewish people had nowhere to run except east through Russia. All 11 time zones of it. LA to New York is 4 time zones. This is 11. And they had no one to turn to except those 2 remaining consulates. Russia, no friend to the Jews, would not accept the refugees. But they would allow them passage by train through Siberia to Vladivostok. The refugees could traverse the Russian steppes on 2 conditions. They must pay 5 times the usual price for the train tickets. Ask me afterwards about that train fee, because that's a story in and of itself. They had to pay 5 times the price. And 2, they must have a visa from the country to which they were traveling. But no country would give them visas. In fact, I've read the official communiques between Sugihara and his superiors in Tokyo. Sugihara keeps explaining that there are no consulates left open to issue visas to a destination country. Enter the Dutch. For a fee, the Dutch consul could grant the refugees entry into, get this, Suriname and Curacao. Suriname and Curacao, 2 Dutch colonies in South America that didn't require formal visa documents. These Jewish refugees had never heard of these far-off places. But here was their opportunity. If Japan would grant them transit visas, the Jewish refugees could theoretically take the train from Kaunas through Siberia to Vladivostok, pass through Japan, and set sail for freedom in South America. Waking to find hundreds of Jewish refugees camped outside his door, Sugihara cabled for permission to issue transit visas. Not permanent visas, not even tourist visas, just 10-day transit visas. Permission denied. Three times, Sugihara asked Tokyo to allow him to grant the visas. The third time, the cable came back. Concerning transit visas requested previously, stop. Advise absolutely not to be issued any traveler not holding firm end visa with guaranteed departure from Japan. Stop. No exceptions. Stop. No further inquiries expected. Stop. Permission denied. His wife, Yukiko, would later write about the refugees' plight. They had risked their lives in order to reach this place. Their bodies exhausted, their clothes torn, and their faces tired. I would see them from my window. When they saw me looking at them, they would put their hands together as if praying. It was so hard for me to watch these scenes. They were so miserable. We did not know what to do. We could not sleep at night we kept thinking and thinking what to do. At this point, Sugihara has a choice to make. And the choice very well could have been, it's too big a problem, and it's not my problem. I have a direct order to not do this. If I defy orders and issue these visas, I will lose my career in disgrace and be unable to support my wife and children. Therefore, I'll close the doors and will have served my country honorably. I will have personal security in these troubled times. He could have said, these aren't refugees. They're my enemy. Remember, Germany and Japan, the original axis of evil. But instead, after discussing the matter with his wife, Sugihara chose to protect lives instead of his livelihood. He defied the orders of his superiors and began issuing transit visas. Please understand, I had trouble believing this story. Because you see, I worked for a Japanese company for 25 years. And in 2 decades of working directly with the Japanese every day, I've never once seen one of them defy an order from a superior. I've seen my American coworkers, blow off the boss's directive. Sure, I'll get on that right away. Big eye roll. And then don't do it. But I've never seen a Japanese employee disobey orders from the Home Office. It's just not done. Yes, a Japanese employee may in fact vehemently disagree with a superior's decision, but he will comply. But Sugihara didn't comply. Instead, for 29 days, he hand-wrote visas in triplicate as fast as he could, 18 to 20 hours a day, not stopping to eat a proper meal. He wrote more visas in a day than what would normally be issued in a month. His wife would massage his hand and ice his shoulder just to keep him going. And when the Russian authorities finally came and closed the consulate, Sugihara kept right on writing visas to the very last moment. While on the train to pull out of the station, he was still stamping visas and passing them out the window. Permission granted. To date, over 2,000 visas have been found bearing his stamp. Most of these were to fathers, heads of families, allowing the entire family passage and escape. Estimates are that 6,000 to 10,000 refugees owed their lives to Chiune Sugihara. Now, 3 generations later, 40,000 to 50,000 people can actually trace their very lives to Sugihara's choice. Upon his return to Japan, Sugihara dutifully turned in his stamp and was summarily fired. He lost his job and his livelihood and his position in society. He never worked for the government again. He took odd jobs to support his family during and after the war. Worked as a door-to-door salesman, and eventually became a middle manager for a Japanese trading company. Sugihara was a humble man. He never spoke about what he'd done. And the truth is, he didn't know if it had made any difference at all. He simply didn't know if any of them had made it out of Russia. In fact, it wasn't until 1969, nearly 30 years later, that one of the survivors found him. And soon, many other survivors were telling the story of Chiune Sugihara's compassion. Ultimately, the stories were investigated by a commission of the Israeli Supreme Court. It was all true. And the state of Israel did what they could. In 1985, they named Sugihara righteous among the nations, the highest honor that could be given to a non-Jew, a righteous Gentile. By that time, at 85 years old, he was too frail and too sick to travel. He never did sit in the park in Jerusalem, named in his honor. Solomon was right when he said, "The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life." Chiune Sugihara died on July 31, 1986, 46 years to the day that he made his choice and picked up his pen. This practice is changing now, but for a long time, it was not unusual for the Japanese, when they came to this country, to take on an American name. Easier to pronounce, and I think they believed it helped them fit in. That's why, over the years, I've had Japanese coworkers named Ken and Mac, and my favorite, Sean, a good Irish Catholic Japanese name. In fact, Ken named his American-born daughter Cookie. Now, back in 1985, when Mr. Sugihara was honored in Jerusalem, if he had moved to Israel then, perhaps he might have chosen a Hebrew name. And I'd like to suggest to you that name should have been Oded. Oded. Turn with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 28. I love the sound of analog Bibles. 2 Chronicles 28 records an episode during the time of the divided kingdom, Israel and Judah. Ahaz sits on the throne in Jerusalem. A wicked king in Judah worshiped Baal, made idols, child sacrifice, and generally acted like the Canaanites they were supposed to have rejected. Meanwhile, the northern kingdom of Israel, under Pekah, fought and defeated Ahaz, but was the victory on their merits? Was Pekah stronger better equipped, better trained? Did Israel have better strategies or smarter commanders? No. The Bible makes it very clear. Verse 6. In one day, Pekah, son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah. Why? Because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. God had removed his protection from Judah. And as the commentary points out, when the protection of the Lord is withdrawn, man discovers to his sorrow that the master he has chosen can be exceedingly cruel. Cruel indeed. Down to verse 8. The Israelites took captive from their kinsmen 200,000 wives, sons, and daughters. They also took a great deal of plunder, which they carried back to Samaria. What an army. Pekah's soldiers had defeated 120,000 of what the King James calls Judah's valiant men. And now they were leading a procession of captives, 200,000 of them, 200,000 of the saddest, most hopeless, and bedraggled boys, girls, and women that you could imagine. Had Yukiko Sugihara looked out her window and seen this, she would have wept all the more. This was a trail of tears. The men are all dead. Who are these captives? They are the wives and children who were left after the battle. Widows and orphans. They are helpless because there are no husbands, no brothers, no uncles or fathers left to come and rescue them. Widows and orphans. The very people God had instructed his children to protect. What do you think? About 250,000 people in this procession? 200,000 captives and 50,000 soldiers? We don't really know. But they defeated 120,000. Let's call it 250,000. 50,000 warriors exulting in their triumph, fevered with victory, celebrating their spoils, thinking about dividing the plunder, more hands to add to the workforce, and hey, more slave girls. Can't you just picture their swagger as they approach the gates of their capital city of Samaria? It's likely that most of the inhabitants of the city turned out to greet their returning heroes and husbands. Everyone's excited. The whole town is abuzz. The dignitaries in the front, ready to welcome and praise the troops. We're going to have us a regular ticker tape parade. But verse 9. Something's going to happen here. But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there. Oded looked at this procession, and he didn't see captives and riches and spoils of war. He saw his brethren. And he knew right away what the soldiers were planning, and he knew it was wrong. You see, God had clearly instructed in Leviticus that his people were not to be slaves. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with rigor. Meaning, you aren't to forcibly enslave your brother. And, the verse continues, if thy brother wax poor and sell himself unto the stranger, if he sells himself into slavery, after that he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. We are not called to enslavement, but to redeem. You know, in many ways, that is what we celebrate on Monday for Juneteenth. We are not called to enslave, but to redeem. But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there. And he went out to meet the army when it returned to Samaria. He said to them, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches to heaven. And now you intend to make the men and women of Judah and Jerusalem your slaves. But aren't you also guilty of sins against the Lord your God? Can't you understand that there but by the grace of God go us? Now listen to me. Send back your fellow countrymen you've taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. All we know of Oded is in these 3 verses. And in one other reference later that mentions his son. That's all. 3 verses and he's gone. But in those 3 verses, Oded takes a stand. Like that lone man in Tiananmen Square. He stood before the powerful military of his own country, and Oded said, this cannot proceed. Oded may well be the Bible's first activist. He was not part of the oppressed. He stood to gain nothing and yet risked everything. Much like Sugihara. Oded looked at the long line of captives and the triumphant soldiers. He saw the cheering crowd. Oded knew that a great sin was about to be committed, an evil which could not be undone. Because once the captive children were separated from their mothers, once the prisoners had been sent to sundry parts of the kingdom, once the women had been taken, there would be no way to make this wrong right. Oded had just moments to make his choice. And like Sugihara, Oded could have said, it's too big, and it's not my problem. I'll risk my reputation, my influence, my standing in society. And with all these soldiers here, I may even be risking my life. Imagine. Oded looks around. He's in the midst of a crowd. He's looking at the leaders, the diplomats there in front. Isn't someone going to stop this? Don't they know how wrong this is? But in the faces around him, he sees no reflection of his internal conflict. So Oded makes his choice. He steps out of the comfort and complacency of the crowd. He swallows hard and he prophesies. He speaks forth the word of the Lord. Now listen to me. Send back your fellow countrymen. Send back your brethren. that you've taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. What did he say? That little prophet man is crazy. I'll chop his. And you know what? Before the crowd could recover from its shock at Oded's audacity, before the soldiers could reach for their swords, 4 other voices chime in. Verse 12. Then some of the leaders in Ephraim, Azariah, son of Jehohanan, Berechiah, son of Meshillemoth, Jehizkiah, son of Shalom, and Amasa, son of Hadlai, confronted those who were arriving from the war. You must not bring those prisoners here, they said, or we will be guilty before the Lord. Do you intend to add to our sin and guilt? For our guilt is already great, and his fierce anger rests on Israel. Family, can you see that God always has a remnant? Those who still value his precepts and listen to his voice? And often, there are more of them than is initially apparent. Oded, like Elijah before him, may have felt he was the only faithful one left. But God said, oh no, I've got more in Israel who are faithful to me. You know, at first I was pretty hard on these 4 princes. Oh, sure. Wait till Oded stands out there and says something, and then you find your courage. Yeah, it's true that Oded spoke first. And there is great virtue in being the one with enough faith, because that's what it takes, and courage to speak out alone. But the princes deserve credit too. They may not have answered God's call to their hearts the first time, but the next time they had an opportunity to respond in righteousness, they did. Praise his name. Our God, in his grace, gives us many chances to do what's right. Fathers, hear me. Do not beat yourself up over lost opportunities. We can all look back on times we blew it as dads. Opportunities missed to demonstrate God's ways to our children. Times we've answered harshly instead of with compassion towards their mothers. Many times God calls. We hear his voice, but we don't quite know what to do about it. We don't see our way clear. We don't understand it. Our faith is too weak. The examples around us too poor. Or the peer pressure is too great. And we just let God's call go unanswered in our lives. Vaguely conscious of missing out on something. Unsure of what it was. But if we continue striving to understand the mystery of God in our lives, just as he did for these 4 princes, God will bring that call again. And there is still great virtue and great reward in answering his call the second time. Because Oded and the 4 princes spoke up, we see in verse 14, so the soldiers gave up the prisoners and plunder in the presence of the officials and all the assembly. You know how it is? Once someone comes to break up a fight, the bullies disperse quickly. The soldiers just left. And then something remarkable happens. Verse 15 continues. The men designated by name took the prisoners, and from the plunder they clothed all who were naked. They provided them with clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. All those who were weak they put on donkeys And so they took them back to their fellow countrymen at Jericho, the city of palms, and returned to where? I vividly remember the first time I read this and it hit me. It raised the hair on my arms and still does. Oded was a Samaritan who saw his brethren bruised and bleeding. He saw to it that their wounds were dressed, their bodies clothed, and their needs attended to. He put the weak on donkeys and made sure they all got home. Do you get it yet? Now you know who Jesus was talking about. Oded was the original Good Samaritan. Jesus knew all about Oded when he told that parable. Plot twist, see me later, so did his audience. Jesus spoke of a Jewish man attacked by robbers and left to die. And while the priest and then a Levite passed him by in order not to inconvenience themselves, it was a foreigner, who recognized in that hurting Jewish man a kinsman, his neighbor, his brethren, a man like himself in need of help. He took the time, the inconvenience, the expense to help a stranger. And he did it even though no one would have known if he had simply passed the man by. He too could have said, the man's needs were too great, this is too big a problem, and they weren't his problem, and that he risked nothing by ignoring him. No one would have known, nor would anyone have blamed him if he'd simply minded his own business. In fact, no one would have known if the Good Samaritan had just kept walking. No one would have known if Oded had just kept quiet. No one would have known if Sugihara had just closed the doors. When asked his motivation, why he defied orders and issued the visas, Sugihara simply replied, I pitied them. The Samaritan took pity on the wounded man. Oded pitied the captives. No one would have known if they had looked the other way, but God calls each of us to be righteous among the nations. To be like Jesus, who, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless. We're called to be like Oded, a father to the fatherless. To be like Sugihara, who helped those refugee families not lose their fathers. That our Father may declare us each righteous among the nations is my prayer and my blessing for you. Because the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life. Amen.
Good morning, church. Brother Eric, I love that message. There are a lot of way makers in this world that we don't know about. And this morning, I'm going to play a song for you guys that, honestly, I'll be completely honest with you guys. I learned it last night because it's a song that I guess God wanted me to play. Patrick let me know to play for this Father's Day. And I had numerous songs that I was practicing all 2 weeks. And then God said, no, I don't want you to play that. And now I see why. It's through the message that Eric actually have shared with us this morning. So I'm stepping out my comfort zone, my comfort zone, and playing a song that, I'll be honest with you, I don't know. But it's in my heart, so hopefully the words will transfer into notes that transfer back into your minds and becomes a difference in your life.